All right, so today I'm going to wrap up this overview of angiosperm reproduction and diversity before moving on to the first topic in a number of topics we're going to cover that focus on the structure and function of plants, which will be a real change of pace, and I think it'll be really interesting to you because it's so different from what you see in animals you've probably been exposed to earlier. Give you a lot more appreciation for plants overall. So last time we wrapped up with pollination and these syndromes that are often associated with particular pollinators. I do want to mention as a postscript to that the specializations that I showed doesn't mean that pollinators other than those that were shown for those particular types of plants are the only ones that are effective in pollinating those plants. There is some diversity in pollinators that visit plants even if they have a particularly specialized syndrome. But when you look at the most important pollinators, they invariably turn out to be the ones that fit that syndrome best. So if you read an older textbook, they may kind of dismiss those pollination syndromes like the moth pollination, bird pollination, et cetera, because other visitors do successfully pollinate those plants, other kinds of visitors in many cases. But by far the most important pollinators are the ones that fit the syndrome. In most cases have been studied very much. All right, so life cycle of angiosperms, I just started to talk about that last time. And we're not going to spend much time on this because it's very similar to the gymnosperm life cycle that I introduced with the pine. It still involves pollen and ovules. And I started to talk about, this slide is basically just focused on the male gametophyte, the pollen. And again, the male gametophyte is highly reduced. It develops initially inside the walls of the pollen grain, and it's dispersed to a receptive surface, which in this case remembers the stigma rather than the ovule, which is something different about angiosperms. And then we have the maturation of the male gametophyte. It becomes a mature male gametophyte when it germinates and produces a pollen tube. And in this case, we have the reduction of the male gametophyte down to the minimum possible level for it to function effectively. So it has two sperm at maturity. The first mitotic division results in a tube cell and a generative cell, but there's a second mitotic division where that generative cell undergoes mitosis and becomes two sperm. And each of those sperm is important in reproduction. And then the tube cell mediates the growth of the pollen tube. So this is totally stripped down as far as an organism goes, but it's still a multicellular organism, even though there are only 3 cells at maturity. All right, so the female gametophyte is even more dramatically reduced compared to what we saw in the pine and the gymnosperms. Remember, the female gametophyte develops completely within the confines of the ovule. So it's inside the megasporangium. Of course, it germinates from a single megaspore, just as in the gymnosperm or pine case. So there's only one functional product of meiosis inside the megasporangium. It germinates to form a megagametophyte. So that's all the same, more or less, as what we saw in the gymnosperms. But remember that in gymnosperms, the female gametophyte is pretty sizable. If you've eaten a pine nut, that's a substantial amount of tissue, and most of that's female gametophyte, except for the embryo that's embedded inside of it that's developing and using it as a food source. But in this case, the female gametophyte at maturity is only a 7-celled organism, so not that much more substantial than the male gametophyte, really. There's a lot of diversity in the female gametophytes of flowering plants, but the most common condition is to have 7 cells and 8 nuclei. One of the cells has 2 nuclei, which is an important cell mentioned here in a moment. So there's an egg, just as there is in any female gametophyte, a single egg, and it's flanked on either side by cells called synergids. There's one on each side of it. Some people argue that that might be the last vestige of an archegonium, but there's really no obvious archegonium in flowering plants, unlike in many gymnosperms, like the pine, which we saw earlier. So we've lost the gametangia pretty much altogether in the flowering plants. There's no antheridium. There wasn't in any no-seed plants have antheridia, and there's no archegonia, unlike in the case of many of the gymnosperms. The pollen tube then will grow into the micropyle, into the ovule, after it's germinated on the stigma, as you see here. And you can see both sperm there entering the female gametophyte, which is also sometimes called an embryo sac, if people want to be sort of neutral about whether the female gametophyte is really an organism or not, but we're going to treat it as an organism. And it releases, of course, one sperm that fertilizes the egg, and we have a zygote formed there, diploid. But the other sperm actually undergoes a fusion too with the 2 nuclei of what's called the central cell, which is the largest cell. And you see them called polar nuclei there. Those are the 2 nuclei with which the other sperm fuses. So we get a triploid nucleus from that fusion. And then we have a lot of mitotic divisions going on that provide the food then for the developing embryo that forms from that zygote. So before the zygote starts undergoing mitotic divisions to become an embryo, we have a lot of mitotic divisions forming the food for that embryo from this second product of fertilization, the endosperm nucleus of that central cell. And so this is really unlike the case in the gymnosperms, remember, where the female gametophyte is the main food source of the developing embryo. In that case, in the gymnosperms, the parent sporophyte of that female gametophyte has invested a lot of resources in that female gametophyte. Female gametophyte is completely dependent on that parent sporophyte, the pine tree in the case that we looked at. So that pine is actually investing a huge amount of resources in a female gametophyte that may never reproduce if pollination doesn't occur. And so there's a potential for a lot of wastage of resources, which isn't the case in flowering plants because they wait to make the food for the embryo until after fertilization. So the double fertilization event, the most significant thing about that is that it's a delay in investment in resources for the embryo. So that could be a real advantage in terms of the potential there. And also I should mention that if fertilization doesn't occur in angiosperms, they haven't invested that much. There's a female gametophyte, but it's not very substantial. And the ovules are often really tiny in angiosperms compared to a lot of the gymnosperms prior to fertilization. So that's something to think about. So, okay, so when we look at an angiosperm seed in this cartoon vision here, just like in the gymnosperms, we have a diploid embryo from fertilization of the egg. But again, unlike in the gymnosperm, we have a triploid nutritive tissue that is from that second fertilization event. And we have then the outer layer of the mature seed represent that the ripened integuments that become the seed coat. Those were tissues that were contributed by the parent sporophyte of the gametophyte that gave rise to that embryo. And in contrast, on the left, you can see, on the right is just what you're looking at, but on the left is the gymnosperm seed, where again, we have a diploid embryo, we have diploid seed coat, just as in angiosperms, but the nutritive tissue is the female gametophyte, which is haploid. So there's some difference, major difference here. And it's really unclear whether the ploidy level, haploid versus triploid, is of any significance at all in terms of nutritive value for the developing embryo, but there's a fundamental difference in the morphology here. And the most important thing is to note that triploid nutritive tissue is something formed after fertilization, whereas on the left it's the previous generation. It's the generation that gave rise to the diploid embryo, and it's a fairly substantially large organism. All right, so now we're going to move on to one of the really important innovations of flowering plants that we don't see in any other seed plants. None of the gymnosperms produce fruit. And they do have cones that function in dispersal, but fruit is an innovation of angiosperms in addition to the various important innovations we've already talked about, like flowers, and especially carpels, where the ovary provides a protective function and also a selective function to some extent on the male suitors of the female gametophytes there. And it also, we talked about double fertilization and the later investment in resources and this extreme reduction in the gametophytes, which are further reduced in both size and duration. So further protection and minimization of the gametophyte generation. But fruit is also a really important innovation, which in its simplest form is really just a mature ovary, the fully formed ovary after fertilization has occurred. So the ovary of the pistil, and there can be more than one pistil or carpel in an individual flower, or there can even be multiple flowers that contribute to the fruit, but minimally a fruit is a ripened ovary, and that ripened ovary becomes all or part of the fruit. And fruits then can function in protection of the developing seeds and also in the dispersal of the seeds, although not always in dispersal. To some extent, they're going to be involved in dispersal. We often think of fruit as something fleshy, but fruits can be dry or fleshy, depending on the adaptation with regard to dispersal. They can also open at maturity, can be dehiscent, and release the seeds, and the seeds can be the real dispersal unit, in which case they're functioning mostly in protection, or they can actually be really integral to the dispersal of the seed. And if we look at the morphology of fruits, they're, for convenience, they're categorized into 3 different types. And the simplest type, which is well named, the simple fruit, is just a fruit derived from a single ovary. And a great example of that, something like a cherry or an apricot. These are obviously fleshy fruits. We see huge variation in the fruits that can form from a single ovary being fleshy or not, being dehiscent, or in the case of fleshy fruits, generally not dehiscent, not opening up at maturity. Another type of fruit that you no doubt enjoyed are aggregate fruits, and these are fruits that are derived from more than one unfused carpel of a single flower. And a great case of an aggregate fruit is something like a raspberry or blackberry, where each of the little fruitlets, the little units of the fruit, is a separate carpel, separate pistil. But these are all of a single flower, so all the other flower parts, the sepals, petals, stamens, are all attached down here. But the entire set of fruitlets tends to be dispersed as a unit, eaten all at once. And so it's really an aggregate of many fruitlets that function together as a dispersal unit. And finally, multiple fruits are the most complex fruits in terms of being derived from an entire inflorescence, an entire flowering stalk of highly compressed flowers. The flowers are all highly congested in a compact inflorescence, like a pineapple, which you can see on the left. While it's in flower, what goes on to become the pineapple fruit at the far right is actually a whole inflorescence of multiple flowers. And each of the little evident units that you can see on the outside of the pineapple is the ovary of an individual flower. And these are all coalescent together into a single fruit, or a single major dispersal unit. And so here's, again, the simple aggregate and multiple fruit. And it's important to realize that these are categories of convenience. It's not a taxonomy that reflects relationship. There's a lot of different origins, for example, of aggregate fruits and multiple fruits. And this is just a way that people have classified fruits to be able to talk about their morphology, not about the relationships of the plants that have these different types of fruits. All right, and another last sort of major type of fruit that we're going to talk about takes in all 3 of these other types, and it's a subset of these other types, and that's an accessory fruit. This only applies to fleshy fruits. And a fleshy fruit, an accessory fruit is just a fruit where the majority of the fleshy parts of that fruit are derived from tissues other than the ovary. And we can have accessory fruits that are simple, accessory, or multiple. And an apple or a pear is a really great example that you're no doubt really familiar with that represents a simple accessory fruit. And the really tasty, most fleshy part of an apple, the juiciest, most delicious parts, are not the ovary, not the ripened ovary. The ripened ovary is the papery core that we tend to discard. The actual fleshy part is what we call a floral tube. And that floral tube is fused around the ovary. And basically a floral tube is just the bases of the sepals, petals, and stamens that are fleshy and fused together and fused around the ovary in this case. And if you've looked at an apple very closely, you've probably noticed that up at the opposite end from the stalk, where the pedestal of the fruit there, you can see what's left of the sepals, the stamens, and the styles there. The petals have already fallen off. But those sepals, petals, and stamens all attached down at the base there, and they connect through their vascular tissue up to the free parts at the tip, but these fused parts are the fleshy parts of the fruit. Another type of accessory fruit, another type of accessory fruit, this should say aggregate, sorry. This is a mistake on the slide. This should say aggregate fruit here. A type of aggregate accessory fruit is strawberry. That's probably that's the best example that we have from commercially grown fruits that you'd be familiar with. And you no doubt notice the little grainy structures on the outside of a strawberry fruit. Those are actually the free carpels. Those are not seeds. Those are one-seeded, dry, indehiscent fruits. That is, fruits that don't open at maturity. And the fleshy part is the receptacle, the base of what was originally the flower on which those parts are born. And you can see the sepals on the far right there. The petals would have been just to the inside of those sepals and stamens there as well. So they're the receptacle. The base of the flower becomes the fleshy part. And finally, an accessory multiple fruit, in addition to the pineapple that showed earlier, would be something like a fig. And a fig is a bizarre kind of inflorescence where it's really inverted. The whole thing is sort of turned to the inside, and the flowers face the center of the fruit. The flowers are very small. There's a large number of them, and they're pollinated by wasps that enter the fruit and actually reproduce inside the fruit. And it's a really interesting coevolutionary scenario. But the fleshy part of that inflorescence then represents basically it's the entire inflorescence. The ovaries of these small flowers represent a really minor component of that fruit. So anyways, these are some other. So you can see that fruit evolution has been really diverse, just as flower evolution has been. Yeah. Not necessarily. Yeah, you have to remember that in many of our commercial fruits have been selected. There are some plants that require fertilization in order to fully develop the fleshy parts of the fruit, but there also are fruits where selection has resulted in normal fruit development even in the absence of fertilization. I mean, it depends across different plant groups, but the fruits of commercially grown plants are often highly modified. For example, we'll get into seeds and dormancy in a moment, but a lot of these dormancy mechanisms have been selected against in commercially grown plants, so that there's no hindrance to germination. So we manipulated these plants a lot. When you think of a banana, I didn't show an example of a banana, but a banana is completely sterile. If you cut a banana open, the little black dots inside of the banana, those are just little vestiges of infertile seeds, ovules that never amount to anything. It's a sterile triploid, and if it was fertile, you'd bite into it and break all your teeth because there'd be big seeds in wild bananas. But the fleshy tissue continues to form even though these are completely sterile fruits. So there's a lot of manipulation that's happened commercially in fruits. So we can get around some of these problems. But a lot of commercial fruit trees, plants that have fruit that's grown commercially, require pollination, and it's a real problem. The pollinator crisis with honeybees dying out due to infections from fungi and mites and that sort of thing that have gotten around. It's a real issue. So it's not. I'm just making a generalization here that, to the extent possible, selection by people has tended to maximize the potential for fruit development without special treatment. But in many cases, pollination is required. All right. So you just last time saw all this diversity of pollination that has evolved in flowering plants, and that you could think of the act of pollination as a type of dispersal. It's really the dispersal of the male gametophyte. But there's another type of dispersal that's really important in flowering plants, and that's dispersal of the young sporophyte inside the seed. And the dispersal mechanisms that angiosperms have evolved are arguably as vast as the pollination mechanisms to disperse the male gametophytes. And they can involve both abiotic, that is physical factors, forces, as shown here, or biotic forces, animals, just as in pollination. And on the left here, you see a number of examples of dispersal by wind in flowering plants that involves different kinds of dispersal units. And for example, there are some dehiscent fruits, as I mentioned, they open at maturity and release the seeds. And the seeds can have innovations like wings on them derived from the seed coat that can allow them to disperse in wind. Another example of wind dispersal is the fruit can be dry and have wings itself, with the seeds contained inside, like a maple fruit that basically, as it falls through the air, it spirals around like a helicopter prop and moves some distance from the parent plant. Or a dandelion up in the upper right there, where it's not just the fruit there, but also the sepals attached at the top that are parachute-like and that result in wind dispersal. And the most extreme example of other parts of the plant, other than the ovary being involved in dispersal, is something like a tumbleweed or Russian thistle, where the entire plant above ground breaks off, is more or less spherical and pretty light, and is carried by the wind. And the entire plant is the dispersal unit in that case. Water dispersal is something we don't necessarily think about as much, but there are a lot of examples. You go to tropical islands, a lot of the plants near the shoreline have buoyant seeds or buoyant fruits that are impervious to salt water prior to breaking dormancy. They're totally impervious to hydration. Something like a coconut has the largest seed of any. There are coconuts that have the largest seeds of any flowering plants, and are encased in a water-resistant fruit that has a huge amount of endosperm inside. If you've drank coconut milk, that's the acellular endosperm. That's endosperm that it's full of nuclei. There are no cell walls or cell membranes that separate those nuclei from one another, but the meat of the coconut on the outside is the cellular endosperm. That is where the nuclei are compartmentalized into cells. And the embryo is really tiny. It's difficult to find in there. So there's enough food resources in a coconut for this plant or for this dispersal unit to be at sea for weeks or even months and still remain viable. So there's a lot of innovations associated with wind and water dispersal. But animal dispersal is equally impressive, and it involves both fleshy and dry fruits. So some dry fruits, and also it can be active or it can be passive. So kind of passive dispersal, one can think of in the most extreme sense is where the plant just brushes up, or the animal brushes up against the plant, and the fruit or the seed, if the seed's the dispersal unit, has some sort of sticky exudate on it, causes it to adhere to the animal, or it might have hairs that have hooks on them. It might even be a really pretty severe adaptation and have barbs, which sometimes just get entangled in wool or feathers. But there are some plants like the puncture vine that's specialized for puncturing the feet of mammals. And if you've ever stepped on one of these things, like I have, you know that they're really painful and they're a little difficult to extract. Kind of like they can be very painful, and it can take a while to get them out. So the animal has to walk along, probably limping some distance before removing them. Also, an obvious type of animal dispersal is ingestion of a fleshy fruit. The plants aren't just trying to feed us; they're not altruistic. The animals are carrying their seeds around and serving as a dispersal unit, and the animals are inadvertently providing a fertilizer source for those seeds when they come out the other end, like in this case of the black bear feces here. And the seeds sometimes in plants that have this type